The copyright of this recording and its intellectual content remains with me, and no part of this video or its content should be used or shared without my explicit permission. The Beasts of a Lost Age: Progress, Romanticism and Red Deer in British Popular Natural History, 1775 to 1860. With increasing concerns regarding the human impact on the natural world and the role of human activity on the growing number of species facing extinction, scholars within the fields of environmental history, animal history, and animal studies have increasingly explored shifts in attitudes towards extinct, charismatic species such as the dodo, the great auk, the passenger pigeon, and the thylacine, as well as animals brought back from the brink, such as the North American bison. More recent investigations within the fields of extinction history and extinction studies have further explored how people and communities have responded to and engaged with the loss of specific non-human animals at a local and global level. Dolly Jorgensen, for instance, has demonstrated that the sense of loss, often surrounding the disappearance of non-human animals, is frequently intertwined with a nostalgic longing for a landscape populated with impressive, charismatic native species, as a response to conceptions of progress and advancement exemplified through an acute control over the natural world. This corresponds with Thomas R. Dunlap's argument that British settler colonial appreciation for Australian landscapes and fauna only occurred when Australia's dislocation from Britain had become sufficient to allow for the emergence of a deeper cultural relationship with indigenous plants and animals. Through her work on the thylacine, Carol Freeman has highlighted how understandings of this animal transformed from its 19th century image as a dangerous, primitive, and verminous predator to a 20th and 21st century symbol of Tasmanian and Australian uniqueness, of pristine wilderness and conservation, a cultural fetish or totemic icon invested with regional, national, and global significance. Indeed, continuing reports of thylacine sightings in Tasmania serve to show how cultural desires for a living connection with this animal inevitably stem from its absence from the Tasmanian landscape, with the paleozoologist and scholar of cryptozoology Darren Naish recently asserting that these sightings constitute a social phenomenon, not a zoological one. This paper will contribute to the discourse on shifting attitudes towards declining charismatic native species by examining how a sense of loss surrounding the disappearance of the red deer in Britain, expressed through narratives of nostalgic longing for a lost age, gradually emerged within late 18th and early 19th century British popular natural history literature. It will further reveal how changing perceptions of the red deer were deeply influenced by the cultural attributes ascribed to it within this specific historical context, informed initially by Enlightenment ideas of societal progress and, increasingly, by a romantic sense of loss and longing, inspired by a growing appreciation of wilderness and the sentimentalization of the Scottish Highlands. Constructions of the red deer by 18th century naturalists innately confined it to Britain's past, as its prevalence was frequently located within narratives of lineal societal progress that corresponded with contemporary Enlightenment models of stadial development, as articulated by Scottish Enlightenment thinkers such as Adam Smith, John Miller, and William Robertson. In his 1766 British Zoology, for example, the Welsh naturalist and travel writer Thomas Pennant charted the red deer's existence in Britain over time, first noting how, in the island's ancient past, these non-human animals knew no other limits than that of the ocean, nor confessed any particular master. He further stated how the red deer's high status had evolved as a charismatic game animal favoured by the Anglo-Saxon and Norman kings, temporalizing the species within a historicized and civilized past through its associations with these former barbarized elites. Pennant asserted that, under Norman rule, homes and churches alike were transformed into one vast waste to make room for red deer, the objects of a lawless tyrant's pleasure, emphasizing the unjust and tyrannical nature of medieval kingship, which placed the status of the red deer above that of the suppressed English people. These sentiments echoed imaginings of the Norman yoke that had formed an integral part of English discussions surrounding national progress since the 16th century, and, although most potently invoked by writers and polemicists during the 17th and 19th centuries, these were frequently expressed by 18th century Enlightenment writers within their broader Anglo-centric narratives of societal development in Britain. Indeed, Pennant presented the contemporary status of the red deer as a product of economic, agricultural, cultural, legal, and constitutional reforms, and its increasing confinement to deer parks as a sign of progress that paralleled the emergent constitutionalism of the modern British state. Commenting on the inversely proportional relationship between the decline of the red deer in Britain and societal progress, Pennant stated that, When property became happily more divided by the relaxation of the feudal tenures, these extensive hunting grounds became more limited, and as tillage and husbandry increased, the beasts of chase were obliged to give way to others more useful to the community. The vast tracts of land before dedicated to hunting were then contracted, and, in proportion as the useful arts gained ground, either lost their original destination or gave rise to the invention of parks. Pennant's sentiments were reiterated by many late 18th century popular natural history authors, such as Oliver Goldsmith, who, in his 1774 A History of the Earth and Animated Nature, similarly constructed the disappearance of the red deer from Britain as an indicator of the nation's social, legal, cultural, and economic modernity. Ralph Bilby, in Thomas Bewick's 1790 A General History of Quadrupeds, also referred to the Norman destruction of villages and churches to produce one wide waste that the tyrant of the day might have room to pursue his favourite diversion, and tied the gradual disappearance of the red deer to the contraction of these wide extended scenes of desolation and oppression, and the spread of agriculture and commerce over the naked land. In his 1809 Memoirs of British Quadrupeds, the prolific popular natural history author Reverend William Bingley also situated the red deer's shifting status within a narrative of Britain's development into a civilized nation, founded on ideas of personal liberty, industriousness, and commerce. Indeed, the species decline in Britain was generally conceptualized within broader narratives of national improvement, especially those that centered around the intensive cultivation of the British landscape. The journalist, publisher, and illustrator Frederick Schobel, for instance, noted in his 1832 Natural History of Quadrupeds that, with the progress of civilization and agricultural improvement, the number of red deer in Great Britain has gradually diminished. Conversely, the enduring presence of the red deer in Britain's peripheral territories was understood to signify backwardness and a lack of cultivation. For example, contemporary British writers, informed by metropolitan beliefs, frequently presented the substantial populations of red deer in the Scottish Highlands as illustrative of the landscape's pre-modern status and the societal stage ascribed to the Scottish Highlanders. This can be seen through the temporalizing relationship that Pennant created between the red deer and the Gaelic-speaking minority of the Highlands, when he stated that the red deer hunting parties formerly assembled by Highland chieftains possessed the magnificence of an Eastern monarch. Through this exoticization of their interaction with the red deer, the Scottish Gaels were distanced from contemporary understandings of Anglo-centric modernity. The temporalization of the red deer in Scotland was also illustrated through ideas of liberty that were ascribed to Anglo-centric modernity and contrasted with notions of enduring despotism in the Highlands. In the 7th volume of the Naturalist Library, published in 1838, for instance, the Scottish naturalist William MacGillivray reflected that, compared to the extensive game laws of the Norman kings, the proprieties in the north of Scotland were scarcely less tyrannical 30 or 40 years ago, and I have heard of instances of despotism connected with the red deer that would sound strangely in the ears of Englishmen of the present day. James Aikman similarly remarked that, when the game laws were in perfection in England during the reigns of William Rufus and Henry I, it was less criminal to destroy one of the human species than a beast of the chase, an absurdity not quite paralleled in our own country by imprisoning a man for shooting a hare. Although Enlightenment ideas prevailed within constructions of the red deer in late 18th and early 19th century British popular natural history, romantic sentiments within these narratives had become more overt, and by the 1830s, the red deer was increasingly and nostalgically presented as a symbol of Britain's romantic past. Indeed, following the Highland revival of the early 19th century, the discourse surrounding the disappearance of the red deer from Britain was strongly infused with a sense of melancholic loss, informed by a broader national context of romantic nostalgia for a pre-modern age and shifting attitudes towards the Highlands. Following the defeat of the Jacobite uprising of 1745 and the dissolution of the clan system by the British state, a metropolitan-led programme of internal colonisation, frequently couched in the language of improvement, was implemented in the Scottish Highlands. Many Scottish landowners eagerly participated in these efforts, as, according to Frederick Albert and Johnson, the improvement ideology involved not just a search for profits, but also a form of political action and cultural consumption, regarded as a vehicle to higher social status within polite society. However, these improvement discourses also supported claims of Highland uniqueness, which challenged notions of British hegemony. Pennant and many other late 18th century British naturalists and travel writers emphasised that improvement was best achieved through the enhancement of local agricultural practices and industries, and Lord Kames, one of the most prominent Scottish advocates of Highland improvement, presented his modernisation rhetoric in syncretic terms, challenging conceptions of the Highlands as innately backward and resisting its subsumption into broader British systems of agriculture. By the late 18th century, as memories of the 1745 uprising had begun to fade and Gaelic political and economic autonomy had been dissolved, the hostility towards the Highland landscape and culture formerly encountered within British metropolitan circles started to wane. By the 1780s, confiscated land had largely been returned to the Highland elite, and many of the laws that had prohibited Highland dress and customs had been repealed. Furthermore, the growing influence of Romanticism in literary works, such as Macpherson's collation of the Ossian epics, first published in the 1760s, but remaining popular into the 19th century, and Sir Walter Scott's fiction, particularly his 1814 novel Waverley, increasingly encouraged popular reimaginings of the Gaels as a heroic warrior people. Indeed, this new interest in Highland culture permeated the upper echelons of British society and is best captured through King George IV's active engagement in overt performances of Highland primitivism, overseen by Walter Scott during his visit to Scotland in 1822. By the 1830s and 1840s, British aristocrats were increasingly drawn to the Highlands for deer stalking and shooting, and by the 1840s, a Highland tourism industry centering around the middle classes had similarly developed. Commenting on the Highland revival, Silke Stroh points out that this celebration of national heritage not only romanticised Highland identity, but further temporalised it, explaining that it seemed as if a progressive Scotland mainstream ran forward into the future, while throwing affectionate backward glances over its shoulder to look upon a Highland culture doomed to obsoleteness. Following the Highland revival, constructions of the red deer in early 19th century British popular natural history increasingly emphasised the animal's connection to Britain's romantic past. For example, in her 1836 Wild Animals, Their Nature, Habits and Instincts, Mary Roberts' description of the red deer was expressed through the language of sentimental pathos, and her sadness at the animal's disappearance from Britain was palpable. She reiterated Pennant's claim that Highland chieftains hunted red deer with the magnificence of Eastern monarchs, but firmly located her red deer within a British past steeped in nostalgic romanticism, her chieftains chasing the wild deer through their good green woods with pomp and equipage. Roberts similarly referenced the Chevy Chase, an English folk ballad popularised by Bishop Thomas Percy in his 1765 Relics of Ancient English Poetry, which had become a major source of inspiration for British Romantic writers and artists of the 19th century. But her commentary lacked Pennant's scepticism regarding its authenticity. The broader influence of Romanticism on 19th century works of British popular natural history can also be seen through the repeated references to Sir Walter Scott's writings within constructions of the red deer. James Fennell quoted Scott to describe the red deer as the antlered monarch of the waste, and the writer and publisher Charles Knight referred to scenes of deer hunting from Waverley in order to communicate how the splendour and danger of this activity would deeply intertwine with the species. These romantic connotations and the growing sentimentalisation of the Scottish Gaels and the Highland landscape all served to emphasise the red deer's charismatic status, but the species remained temporalised within Britain's past due to the human-animal relationships that continued to characterise it and the romanticisation of the landscape it inhabited. Here, parallels can be drawn with Sir Edwin Landseer's romantic depiction of the red deer in his 1851 The Monarch of the Glen, which captured the contemporary popular imaginings of this species as a noble animal and an essential component of the Highland landscape. By the mid-19th century, the red deer, as an enduring wild species of the Scottish Highlands, was actively celebrated by British popular natural history authors as a potent symbol of Britain's long-lost past. Charles Knight, for instance, lamented the red deer's decline in Britain and its confinement to peripheral territories, presenting this as an unfortunate product of modern British progress by stating that the deforesting of vast woodland tracts and the extension of agriculture have limited the range of this noble animal to the large parks and chases of our country, to the Cheviot Hills and to the heath-covered mountains of Scotland. William Carpenter, in his 1844 Popular Cyclopedia of Natural Science, similarly claimed that in England, very few of these noble animals still exist, and these are mostly in a half-domesticated state, but many still remain in the mountainous and woody parts of Scotland. Ironically, these representations of the red deer as an icon of the Scottish Highlands and of Britain's romantic past coincided with the growth of modern Scottish deer forests that initially occurred during the economic recession that gripped the Highlands following the Napoleonic Wars, and then later to meet the rising demand for deer stalking that emerged with Highland tourism. To summarize, a sense of loss surrounding the disappearance of the red deer in Britain gradually emerged in constructions of the species within late 18th and early 19th century British popular natural history literature through narratives of nostalgic longing for a pre-modern age. Earlier constructions were predominantly informed by Enlightenment ideas of societal progress and stable development, but with the growing romantic appreciation for wilderness and the sentimentalization of the Scottish Highlands following the Highland Revival, imaginings of the red deer became increasingly infused with a sense of loss. These findings also demonstrate how shifting attitudes towards the red deer were strongly influenced by its temporalized status, its relationship with humans, and the landscape it inhabited. More broadly, this paper raises some interesting questions regarding the ways in which humans strive to connect with a lost past through extinct or disappearing charismatic species, and how this can shape human desires to connect with these non-human animals.